A bitter wind whipped through the Colorado highlands, clawing at the windows of Earl Whitmore's log cabin. It was one of those nights when the sky pressed down, black and heavy, and the world seemed to have shrunk to the ring of firelight flickering against rough-hewn pine walls. Earl, shoulders hunched under a faded flannel, reached to poke at the burning logs with a rusted iron rod. He had lived alone for years now, ever since retirement. Just him and Shadow. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a retired canine, a big German shepherd with gray threading through his black fur, a crooked ear, and a limp that never fully healed after his last duty call. They'd both grown used to silence, broken only by the hiss of the fire, the howl of wind, or sometimes the sound of Shadow's soft, wary breathing as he slept by the hearth. It was a night for staying inside, for stories and strong coffee, not for daring the frozen wilds beyond the porch. But suddenly, everything changed. One moment Shadow lay curled at Earl's feet, his breathing deep and steady. The next, he shot up, muscles quivering, nose twitching at some unseen scent. His ears pricked forward, alert, almost feral. Earl's heart hammered. He'd seen that look before, back in the days when Shadow would scent out bombs or bodies, reading danger in the wind. "Easy, boy. What's out there?" Earl's voice was rough, thick with age and worry. Shadow ignored him, paws already scraping against the hardwood as he bounded to the door, barking. A deep, desperate sound Earl hadn't heard in years. Earl lunged for the door, but Shadow was already shoving past him, throwing his weight against the warped pine as if nothing could stop him. The door crashed open, and Shadow plunged out into the night, swallowed by the swirling white. Earl stumbled after him, the shock of cold air stealing his breath. Snow stung his eyes, blinding him. He shouted, voice ragged with panic, "Shadow! Get back here, damn it! Shadow!" But the wind tore the words away, scattering them into the vast dark. He could just make out the shape of his old dog, a patch of black darting across the white, already half lost in the storm. For a moment, Earl stood paralyzed, fear crackling in his chest. He'd lost too much in his life to risk losing Shadow, too. He pulled on his boots with shaking hands, fingers clumsy and numb. With each step onto the porch, he felt his own age, the sharp bite of loneliness, the cold pressing into his bones. He looked for Shadow's tracks, saw them disappear almost instantly under a fresh wave of powder. Earl clung to the porch post, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His thoughts spun. Had Shadow smelled a bear, a mountain lion, or something worse? Someone out there who shouldn't be. The wilderness out here wasn't as empty as people thought. There were secrets buried in the pines, and Earl knew how easily the land could swallow a soul whole. But there was something different tonight. Shadow hadn't run from fear. He'd run toward something, driven by a purpose that Earl couldn't see or understand. It was as if some ancient instinct had woken inside him, dragging him forward, heedless of pain or age or the deadly cold. As the storm closed in, Earl's mind ran wild. He pictured Shadow lost, limping through the forest, freezing or hurt, or worse, never coming back. He cursed his own helplessness. He called into the night until his throat burned. Nothing. The wind swallowed everything. The only evidence Shadow had ever existed was a faint trail of paw prints, already fading, erased by the blizzard, as if the dog was being erased from the world itself. Inside, the fire burned lower. The cabin felt empty, haunted. Earl wrapped himself in a heavy coat, grabbed his flashlight, and the old revolver he kept by the door. He tried to steady his breathing. He wasn't the man he used to be, and neither was Shadow. But maybe, just maybe, old instincts still counted for something. He stared into the woods, searching for any sign. In his mind, he replayed every warning, every lesson from years in the parks. Never go out in a storm. Never chase a dog into the dark. But he couldn't abandon Shadow. He wouldn't. He tried the radio, calling out to anyone who might be awake, anyone who might have seen a big dog heading north. Static answered back. Ash Hollow was a long way from anywhere, and on a night like this, nobody came out unless they had to. He felt a tremor of real fear, the kind that makes you feel like a child again, small and powerless before the wild. Out there, somewhere, Shadow ran, driven not by fear, but by an urgent need Earl could only guess at. He thought of all the stories he'd heard, of animals sensing earthquakes before they hit, of dogs saving children from burning houses, of impossible rescues that defied logic. Was that what this was? Or was he just an old man, losing his last friend to a world he no longer understood? He pressed his forehead to the icy window, desperate for any sign. And as the night deepened and the storm howled, Earl was left with one terrifying, unanswerable question. What had Shadow sensed in the dark? And would it cost them both everything they had left? In the heart of Ash Hollow, the town's police department was little more than a converted gas station perched along a frozen stretch of highway. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the old heater rattling in the corner and the relentless ticking of a battered wall clock. Deputy Megan Harris sat alone behind the front desk, her fingers drumming anxiously on the scratched veneer. She should have been halfway through her shift log, but she kept glancing at her phone, waiting for a message that never came. Officer Noah Carter, her partner and sometimes confidant, had been out on a narcotics surveillance op. Something low-key, Sheriff Dobson had insisted, just a routine check. But Noah hadn't checked in for 2 days now. Megan's stomach twisted with unease. She'd called his cell, radioed every 10 minutes, driven by his house just in case, but all she'd found was silence. When she tried to bring it up with Sheriff Dobson, he'd brushed her off with a gruff, "He's a big boy, Harris. Probably shacked up somewhere warm. Don't make problems where there ain't any." But Megan knew Noah. He wouldn't disappear without a word, not with a storm rolling in, not with dealers lurking out by the old iron bridge. Something was wrong. Every instinct in her gut told her so. She was just pulling on her coat, steeling herself to go out into the night, when the radio crackled with static and an unfamiliar voice. "Dispatch, this is Caroline from Hollow's End Diner. There's a dog, some big dog, barking like crazy out near the iron bridge. Won't stop, scaring folks." A chill ran through Megan, not from the cold, but from the way the words seemed to echo her worst fears. Shadow. She'd heard about the retired K-9 who lived up in the hills, always watching over old Earl Whitmore. If Shadow was out there in the middle of a blizzard, something must be terribly wrong. Megan grabbed her flashlight and badge, heart pounding as she raced out into the snow. The night had settled into a deep, unbroken silence, the kind that felt almost sacred, until you stepped into it and realized how truly alone you were. She shoved her way into the wind, boots crunching through drifts, the bitter cold biting at her skin and making her eyes water. Her breath came fast and ragged, each exhale swirling in the beam of her flashlight. Somewhere far ahead, faint and desperate, she heard it. A dog's bark, sharp and insistent, carried by the wind. Megan pushed herself harder, memories of her childhood dog flickering behind her eyes. She thought of Noah, his goofy grin, the way he always looked out for her, the times he'd stood between her and danger without a second thought. She couldn't let fear stop her now. The bridge loomed ahead, its iron skeleton half lost to the snow. Beneath it, shadows pooled, deep, impenetrable. Megan slid down the embankment, her boots slipping on ice, and nearly lost her footing. The barking grew louder, more frantic. She could just make out the hunched shape of Shadow, his fur caked with ice, his powerful body blocking the way under the bridge. He was barking, not in anger, but in wild, urgent distress. "Shadow! Hey, buddy, it's okay, I'm here!" Megan called out, trying to steady her voice. But Shadow wouldn't move. He pressed himself against something, someone. Megan's heart dropped as she knelt and swept her flashlight's beam over the scene. There, tangled in a mess of ropes and frozen mud, was Noah. His face was battered, blood streaked down his cheek, and his eyes fluttered open weakly at the sound of her voice. "Noah!" Megan's scream tore through the night. She scrambled to his side, hands shaking so hard she could barely undo the knots holding him down. Shadow licked at Noah's face, whining, his tail thumping weakly against the icy ground. Noah's lips barely moved. "Meg, took my gun. Left me, cold." "Don't talk. You're gonna be okay, I promise," Megan choked out, fighting tears. She pulled off her coat, wrapping it around him, her own teeth chattering from the cold. Shadow nudged Noah's hand, refusing to let him drift away. It was a scene straight from a nightmare. Snow piled up around them, threatening to bury the whole world in silence and ice. Megan fumbled for her radio, fingers numb, finally managing to call for backup. "Officer down Iron Bridge! I need an ambulance, now!" As she waited, she pressed closer to Noah, her mind racing. Who had done this to him? What had he seen? Why had Shadow risked everything to come here tonight, as if drawn by some invisible thread? She glanced at the dog, seeing the intelligence in his eyes, the way he never looked away from Noah, as if his whole life's purpose was to keep the man alive just a little longer. The minutes stretched, agonizing and slow. Megan kept talking to Noah, willing him to stay awake. Above them, the storm raged, making every second a battle. She tried not to think about what would have happened if Shadow hadn't found him, if she hadn't listened to her gut and come out into the cold. Finally, distant sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights painted the snow, voices shouted, footsteps crunched. Megan let the medics take over, but she never let go of Noah's hand, not for a second. Shadow circled them, limping badly but refusing to leave. As Noah was lifted onto a stretcher, Megan looked down at Shadow and whispered, "You saved his life tonight." The dog stared back, weary but unwavering, as if to say, "It's not over yet." As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens wailed away into the storm, one question remained, burning in Megan's mind. Would help come in time for both man and dog? Or would the merciless cold claim them before dawn? The storm raged through the night, howling over the high Colorado ridges and battering every shutter in Ash Hollow. Back at his cabin, Earl Whitmore paced restlessly, unable to calm the cyclone inside his chest. The wind rattled the old glass, but it was the silence after Shadow's disappearance that hollowed him out the most. Every creak and groan of the cabin was an accusation. You let him go. You let him walk straight into the dark. Earl found himself standing at the window, forehead pressed against the icy pane, breath fogging the glass. He tried to spot any movement in the swirling snow, but there was nothing. Just the unbroken white, erasing every trace of Shadow's tracks. He pictured the dog out there, limping, confused, perhaps alone and shivering under some half-fallen pine. The thought twisted something deep inside him, a pain sharper than the arthritis in his hands. For the first time in years, Earl felt powerless. The wilderness he'd once roamed with confidence now seemed like a hostile stranger. He tried to focus, to think like the ranger he once was, but age and worry clouded his thoughts. It had been decades since he'd called anyone for help. Pride and habit kept him isolated. But tonight he needed someone who understood. He needed Clara Monroe. He fumbled with the phone, hands clumsy and cold. Clara answered on the third ring, her voice low, steady, and cautious. Always cautious, even after all these years. "Earl, is everything okay out there?" Earl tried to keep the tremor from his voice, but the words spilled out in a frantic rush. "Clara, it's Shadow. He ran off into the storm, like he was chasing something. I've never seen him like that, not since the old days. He's not just gone. He's on a mission, Clara. Something's wrong." There was a pause. Earl heard her breath catch, the faint sound of dogs barking in the background. Her rescues, her life's work. "Earl, you know Shadow. That dog's got more sense than half the folks in this town put together. If he's out there, it's because someone needs him. You taught him that." Earl sank into a chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But he's hurt, Clara. He's not a young dog anymore. He could get lost. Or worse." "I know." Her tone softened, carrying the empathy only someone who'd lived through loss could share. "But you're not going to do this alone. I'll get my coat and come up. We'll look for him together. You and me, just like old times." Earl swallowed hard, remembering all the long, cold nights they'd spent tracking lost hikers or runaway dogs, back when they were both younger, before the world had changed around them. Clara had seen her own share of grief. The Air Force years, the rescue work, the marriage that crumbled under the weight of other people's tragedies. She never talked about it, but it lingered in the way she moved, the way she hesitated before making promises. "Clara, are you sure? The roads—" "Don't argue with me, Whitmore," she cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. "That dog saved my life once. I owe him, and you." Earl let out a shaky breath, something between relief and fear. "All right, I'll be ready." After hanging up, Earl sat for a long moment, the phone heavy in his hand. His mind drifted backward, memories surfacing like old logs in a swollen river. He saw Shadow as a puppy, all ears and paws, eager to please, learning every command with a kind of solemn pride. He remembered his own wife, gone now for so many winters, laughing as Shadow stole socks from the laundry. He remembered the day Shadow took a bullet meant for Earl, and how they'd both limped home together, battered but alive. The loneliness pressed in, relentless and cold. Earl realized that Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the last thread tying Earl to a life worth living. Without him, the cabin was just four walls and a collection of faded photographs. He closed his eyes, feeling the ache of regret settle in. He'd pushed people away for years, convinced he could handle whatever came. But tonight, the emptiness felt too big to fight. He forced himself to gather supplies, a heavy flashlight, flares, a thermos of coffee. He bundled up in layers, wincing as old injuries flared in his knees and hips. By the time Clara's headlights cut through the swirling snow on the long drive, Earl was pacing by the door, pulse hammering, determination and dread tangled in his chest. Clara stepped out, bundled in an oversized parka, her breath pluming in the cold. She carried an old medical kit and a battered backpack full of supplies. There was no small talk. She just squeezed Earl's shoulder, and together they set off into the storm. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches heavy with ice, snow crunching beneath their boots. They called Shadow's name into the wind, voices barely carrying. Each step was a battle, against the cold, against exhaustion, against the memories threatening to overtake them. As they moved deeper into the woods, Earl's thoughts spun wild. Was he too late? Had Shadow already given his all, as he'd done so many times before? What would Earl do if he had to return home alone? Clara walked ahead, her flashlight swinging methodically. She'd always been better at holding herself together. Yet Earl caught her glancing back, checking on him, making sure he kept moving. They both knew what it was to lose, what it meant to keep searching anyway, refusing to let the darkness win. The snow thickened, blanketing the world in silence. Earl's legs ached, but he forced himself on. Every snapped branch, every distant howl made his heart leap with hope and fear. He tried to picture Shadow, brave, relentless, refusing to abandon whoever needed him most. And in that moment, for the first time in a long while, Earl understood something painful and true. Courage wasn't just about facing down danger. It was about admitting when you needed help, about reaching for a friend in the dark, and trusting that together you might still bring someone home. They pressed on, hearts raw and hopeful, two lonely souls against the wild night, searching not just for a lost dog, but for a piece of themselves they'd almost forgotten how to find. The storm was relentless, blanketing the world in white and trapping all warmth beneath its icy weight. Under the old iron bridge, in a hollow just out of the direct wind, Shadow lay pressed against the battered body of Noah Carter. The German shepherd's body trembled, not only from cold but from pain. His old leg injury ached, and his paws were raw and bleeding. Yet nothing would move him from Noah's side. Not the storm, not fear, not exhaustion. Noah faded in and out of consciousness. In the darkness behind his swollen eyelids, his mind spun through half-remembered memories and regrets. He remembered the beginning of his shift, how ordinary it had seemed, driving out near the bridge to keep an eye on a tip about the local drug ring, joking with Megan on the radio, the mundane chatter of another winter's night on patrol. Then, everything had changed in an instant. The ambush, the blows raining down, the ropes cutting into his wrists and ankles. The worst part was not the pain, but the bone-deep cold that seeped into him, numbing his thoughts and stealing his hope. A small, persistent warmth at his side brought him back to the present. Shadow's steady heartbeat. The dog's warm, rough tongue flicking at his face. Noah's cracked lips barely moved. "Hey boy, where'd you come from?" His words were slurred, nearly lost in the wind, but Shadow responded with a gentle nudge, as if to remind him, "You're not alone." Somewhere in the haze of pain and exhaustion, Noah realized how close he was to giving up. He thought about his life, about the mistakes, the distances that had opened up between him and his family, the times he'd buried himself in work to avoid the ache of disappointment. He'd always believed he'd get another chance. Lying there, he wasn't so sure anymore, but Shadow refused to let him slip away. The dog curled closer, sharing what little heat he had left, nudging at Noah's hands, licking his fingers. Each small touch pulled Noah back from the edge. He felt the roughness of the dog's fur, the faint tremor of Shadow's breath, the way the animal's heartbeat thudded through his body. It was a lifeline, a simple primal connection in the heart of the storm. Noah's mind drifted again, but this time the memories were different. He thought of his first day as a cop, how scared and proud he'd felt. He remembered Megan's laugh, the way she never let him quit when things got tough. He remembered his daughter Grace learning to ride a bike, and the way she'd looked at him with absolute trust. He realized now how badly he wanted another chance to see her, to do better, to say the words he'd never said. Shadow sensed Noah slipping away again, with a low whine, The dog began chewing at the ropes that bound Noah's wrists, working with single-minded determination. Years of training surfaced. Shadow knew how to free a trapped handler, knew how to bite and tug in just the right way without hurting. Slowly, painfully, the ropes loosened just enough for Noah's fingers to move. The returning circulation sent bolts of agony up his arms, but it was a good pain, a pain that meant he was still alive. Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking the bridge overhead. Snow drifted down through the gaps in the beams, dusting Noah's hair, frosting Shadow's back. But in that small, hidden hollow, hope flickered. For Shadow, this moment was a test of everything he'd ever learned. The world had always made sense when there was a job to do, a scent to follow, a person to protect, a danger to face. Now, his training and his instinct merged. He pressed his weight against Noah, refusing to let the cold take him. Every time Noah's head slumped or his eyes drifted shut, Shadow licked his face, barked softly, nudged his ribs. He became Noah's anchor to the world, the force that refused to give up. Noah began to whisper, barely audible. "Good boy. Stay with me." Tears stung his eyes, freezing on his lashes. For the first time in his life, he understood the real meaning of courage. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the will to fight on when you had every reason to surrender. He lost track of time. Minutes, maybe hours passed in a blur. But then, faint and far away, he heard the echo of a woman's voice. Megan, calling his name, frantic and raw with worry. Shadow barked in reply, loud and sharp. The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through Noah. Someone was coming. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't lost. The light of a flashlight bobbed along the edge of the bridge. Megan's face appeared, pale and wild-eyed, her breath steaming in the air. Relief poured through Noah as she stumbled toward him, voice cracking with emotion. "Hang on, Noah! I'm here!" Even as help arrived, Shadow remained glued to Noah's side, never relaxing until hands reached out and lifted the officer to safety. Medics swarmed, blankets appeared, and urgent voices buzzed in the air. Shadow allowed them to tend to Noah, but his gaze never left the man's face, as if silently promising, "I will never abandon you." As Noah drifted into a fragile sleep in the warmth of the ambulance, his last sensation was Shadow's muzzle pressed gently into his palm, a silent, unbreakable bond forged in the darkest hour. In that moment, he understood. Sometimes the difference between life and death wasn't just luck or strength. It was the loyalty of a wounded, aging dog who refused to give up hope. The storm had not let up, but Shadow's work was not done. As the medics and Megan hurried Noah into the ambulance, Shadow lingered in the whirl of flashing lights and shouting voices, his fur crusted with snow and blood. Megan tried to coax him into her cruiser, but the German shepherd whined and jerked away, fixated on something beyond the bridge. He looked at Noah one last time through the foggy window of the ambulance, as if burning the man's scent into his mind, then turned and vanished into the blizzard. Megan called after him, her voice sharp and desperate, but Shadow was already a phantom moving through the storm. Something deep inside him had snapped to attention, a sense, almost supernatural, that there was still more to do. The cold burned through his paws, each step sending shocks of pain up his legs, but he pressed forward, snout low to the ground, weaving through drifts and brush. He headed north, guided by a memory from his days as a K-9. There was an abandoned ranger station about 2 miles up the old access road, a place he and Earl had visited countless times on their patrols. Shadow's mind was a jumble of instinct and training, but some part of him knew that help wasn't coming fast enough. Not for Noah, not for the trouble Noah had uncovered before being attacked. Something was still wrong. He could smell it on the wind, the copper tang of blood, the oily chemical stench of fear. As he slogged through the woods, Shadow's breath steamed in the night air. He limped, but his eyes shone with determination. Every few yards he stopped to bark. 3 sharp, clipped yelps, then a pause, then 2 more. A code he'd been taught long ago, a K9's distress signal. Earl had drilled it into him, day after day, until it was as natural as breathing. Now Shadow poured all his strength into each bark, sending his message into the wild, hoping someone would hear. At the same moment, across town, Clara Monroe sat behind the wheel of her battered truck, idling at the edge of a snow-choked road. Earl was beside her, peering out into the swirling white, his jaw clenched with anxiety. Clara was scanning emergency frequencies, her old radio hissing static when she caught something unusual, a rhythmic pattern, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the noise. She stiffened, eyes wide. "Earl, listen! Do you hear that?" He strained to listen, and then recognition dawned. "It's Shadow. That's his distress code." Clara's heart hammered as adrenaline surged through her. Years of training and heartache had taught her to listen for the smallest signs: a broken branch, a whimper in the night, a coded bark across the static. She fumbled with the map, tracing their route to the old ranger station. "He's out there," Clara said, voice trembling between hope and dread. "He's calling for us. He's hurt, but he's trying to lead us somewhere." Without another word, she slammed the truck into gear. The tires spun on the icy road, but she coaxed them forward, following the signal as best she could. Earl's knuckles were white on the dashboard, and he muttered prayers under his breath, fear and guilt twisting inside him. Every mile felt like an eternity. The blizzard made the headlights useless, snowflakes swirling so thick it felt like driving through a dream. Clara kept the radio turned up, her breath coming fast as she matched the barks to Shadow's code. "Hang on, boy. We're coming." Meanwhile, Shadow reached the abandoned station, its shape hulking out of the dark, battered by years of storms and neglect. He forced his way inside through a warped door, nose wrinkling at the stale air. He limped to the old radio desk, memories flashing. Earl's voice, laughter, the sharp tone of commands. With trembling jaws, he pressed the emergency button, releasing another series of coded barks directly into the mic. He could barely stand, but he kept barking, pouring everything he had into the signal. Blood from his paws dotted the cracked linoleum floor. His vision blurred, but he refused to quit. This was his purpose. Somewhere out there, people needed help. Noah was in danger. Earl was searching for him. Shadow barked and barked, refusing to let the pain or exhaustion win. Back in the truck, Clara and Earl finally caught a break in the storm, a glimpse of tracks in the snow, paw prints leading away from the main road. Clara pulled over, and together they stumbled out, following the trail with flashlights slashing through the night. The cold bit deep, but hope kept them moving. Earl called Shadow's name, his voice cracking with emotion, the sound swallowed by the wind. At last, they saw the station's faint outline. As they approached, a ragged, exhausted bark greeted them. Shadow staggered from the doorway, tail wagging weakly, eyes bright with recognition. Earl dropped to his knees in the snow, wrapping his arms around the dog, his own tears freezing on his cheeks. "You did it, boy. You found us," Earl whispered, his relief overwhelming. Clara checked Shadow's wounds with gentle hands, fighting her own tears. "He's hurt, but he made it. We have to hurry. Something's still wrong out there." As they helped Shadow into the truck, Earl glanced back at the ranger station, a sense of dread settling over him. The coded barks, the urgency. Shadow wasn't just trying to save himself. He was warning them. Something bigger was unfolding in Ash Hollow, something that had nearly claimed Noah and now threatened to drag the rest of them into the storm. They sped off, following Shadow's instincts, risking everything as the blizzard raged on. Three souls bound together by loyalty, courage, and a desperate hope that it wasn't too late to save the ones they loved. By the time Clara, Earl, and Shadow reached the iron bridge again, the blizzard had grown so fierce that their flashlights barely pierced the whiteout. The old bridge creaked under the weight of snow and history, the river below an invisible threat in the darkness. Earl's pulse hammered in his ears, and he leaned on Clara as they made their way down the embankment, boots sliding, hearts pounding with dread and urgency. Shadow, battered but unstoppable, led the way. He paused at the spot where he'd found Noah and began to bark, a low, guttural warning that brought both Earl and Clara to a halt. The scene was chaotic. Emergency vehicles clustered along the roadside, their lights a frantic swirl of red and blue across the snow. Megan Harris, still shaking from adrenaline and cold, rushed up the embankment as soon as she saw Earl and Clara. "You found him?" Megan gasped, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She reached out, hugging Shadow, who whined softly and pressed into her, exhausted. "I don't know how to thank you. If it wasn't for this dog, Noah wouldn't have made it." Clara crouched by Noah's side, her hands moving swiftly, checking his pulse, assessing his wounds, wrapping his frozen hands in warm cloth. She glanced up, her eyes fierce. "He's critical, but he's alive. We need a medevac now. He's got hypothermia and possible internal injuries." Earl knelt next to Shadow, stroking the dog's fur, murmuring praise and gratitude. But even in this moment of relief, the sense of danger had not passed. Shadow's gaze kept darting to the road above, his body tense, his growl deepening as the others approached. Megan followed the dog's line of sight and caught something strange. Tire tracks. Not from any emergency vehicle, but fresh, erratic, leading away from the bridge. Her instincts screamed. "Those aren't ours," she muttered, scanning the darkness. "Someone else was here. Maybe the ones who did this to Noah." Clara's hands shook as she continued working, her mind racing through possibilities. If the assailants were still out there, every second counted. Earl's eyes narrowed, remembering all the times he'd chased poachers and criminals through these woods. He knew danger when he felt it, and right now, it was pressing in on all sides. Suddenly, the radio on Megan's belt crackled. "Units responding to Ash Hollow, be advised. Possible narcotic suspects seen headed east. Suspects considered armed and dangerous. All units proceed with caution." The air thickened with tension. Megan looked at Clara and Earl, her jaw set. "You two need to stay back. I'm not letting anything happen to you or Shadow." Earl bristled, but Clara placed a calming hand on his arm. "She's right, Earl. Shadow's done more than enough tonight." But Shadow wasn't listening. With a sudden, fierce bark, he lunged toward the tracks, nose to the ground, tail straight with purpose. He was telling them the danger wasn't over. Earl and Megan exchanged a look, each recognizing the dog's determination. Reluctantly, Megan relented. "All right, Shadow. Lead the way, but stay close." The group followed Shadow, their breath coming in clouds, nerves stretched to the breaking point. The wind howled, and every shadow felt alive with threat. The tracks led to a narrow path through the pines, where headlights had briefly illuminated the snow before vanishing into the trees. At the tree line, Megan signaled for silence. They listened, really listened. hearing for a moment the faintest crunch of footsteps and the low, urgent murmur of voices just ahead. Megan drew her weapon, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Stay back," she mouthed to Clara and Earl, edging forward into the darkness. In the clearing, two figures loomed, burly, bundled in thick jackets, their faces masked by scarves. They were trying to dig something out of the snow. Evidence, perhaps. Something Noah had hidden before he was attacked. The men stiffened as Shadow barked again, louder this time, a battle cry. Megan burst into the clearing, gun raised. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" Chaos erupted. One of the men ran, the other reached for his belt, but before he could pull a weapon, Shadow lunged, knocking him to the ground. Earl and Clara arrived just as Megan cuffed the first suspect, her breath ragged. The second man bolted into the trees, but not before dropping a duffel bag, its contents spilling. Packets of drugs, a handgun, a flash drive glinting in the snow. Clara rushed back to Noah's side, checking his breathing, while Earl held Shadow close, whispering reassurance. Megan called for backup, her voice steady and sure. "Suspect in custody. Evidence recovered. Send all available units. We need this area locked down." As the woods swarmed with officers, Clara did everything she could for Noah, wrapping him in blankets and starting an IV from her kit. Her hands still trembled, but she never let fear win. "Hang on, Noah. We're not losing you tonight." Shadow lay at Noah's feet, guarding him with every ounce of his battered body, growling at anyone who came too close. He had survived bullets and storms, loss and pain, and tonight he would not surrender. Finally, as the medevac helicopter sliced through the storm, its blades thundering above the trees, Megan squeezed Clara's shoulder. "You saved him. All of you did." Her voice was thick with gratitude and exhaustion. "But we're not done. Whoever did this, whatever Noah was investigating, it goes deeper than any of us thought." As they watched the helicopter lift off, carrying Noah into the night sky, they felt both relief and dread. Shadow pressed his nose into Earl's hand, trembling but unbroken. And in that cold, uncertain moment, the unlikely band of rescuers understood. The fight was far from over. Dawn crept reluctantly over Ash Hollow, painting the battered town and snow-drifted woods in ghostly blue light. At the hospital, fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead as Megan paced the sterile hallway outside Noah Carter's room, nerves stretched so tight she could barely breathe. The night's chaos replayed in her head. Shadow's desperate barks, the blinding storm, the criminal's escape, and the moment Noah's pulse had nearly faded away on that frozen ground. Noah was still in critical condition, his skin waxy, breaths shallow beneath a tangle of wires and tubes. Megan hovered at his bedside, willing him to wake up, to give her something, anything, to break open the mystery that had nearly cost him his life. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, her jaw clenched with guilt and determination. She hadn't protected her partner the way she should have. Not this time. The sound of boots in the hall made her look up. Earl and Clara stepped inside, Shadow limping at their heels but eyes burning with purpose. The sight of the dog stirred something in Noah. Even in his haze, he managed a faint smile, and his fingers twitched toward Shadow's fur. Earl sat beside Megan, his face lined with worry. "We're running out of time, Deputy. If those men come back, or if they find what they're after..." Megan nodded, voice rough. "We need to know what Noah was trying to protect. There's got to be something he hid out there. Something that ties this all together." Noah struggled to speak. His voice was a rasp, almost lost in the hum of machines. "My boot. The heel." The effort cost him, and his eyes rolled back, but Clara gripped his hand, reassuring him. "We'll find it, Noah. Rest now. Let us handle it. Megan exchanged a glance with Earl. The ravine by the bridge. That's where they ambushed him. We need to search every inch. Without wasting another second, Earl and Shadow volunteered to go. Megan, still shaking from exhaustion but unwilling to leave anything to chance, insisted on driving them herself. Clara stayed behind, torn between wanting to help and knowing she was needed at Noah's bedside in case he woke again. The blizzard had passed, leaving a brutal calm in its wake. Snow gleamed in the early light, smooth and unbroken except for a set of deep, dog-shaped tracks. Earl followed Shadow down to the ravine, Megan right behind, flashlight in hand. The world felt muffled, as if the storm had stolen even the sound from the air. Shadow moved with fresh energy, nose pressed to the ground, tail swishing as he picked up Noah's scent mixed with oil, leather, and something sharp. Metal, maybe, or adrenaline. He paused at the edge of the icy ravine, pawing anxiously at a patch of disturbed snow. Earl's heart pounded in his chest as he dropped to his knees, digging with gloved hands. It didn't take long. Shadow circled and barked, more urgent than ever. Earl's hand closed around a half-buried police boot, stiff with frost. He pried it free, finding the heel loose. Noah's code for a secret compartment. Earl twisted it open and felt something small and hard tumble into his palm. A USB drive sealed in plastic. Megan let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Let's get that back to the station, fast. But Shadow kept sniffing, refusing to leave. He barked at a nearby bush, tail rigid. Earl glanced at Megan, and together they swept their lights over the area, revealing scuffed boot prints. Evidence someone else had been searching too. Megan's nerves jangled. The suspects weren't far behind. Every second they lingered, danger grew. Back at the police station, Megan plugged the USB into her secure laptop. Earl and Shadow hovered close, tension thick in the cramped office. Files bloomed across the screen. Ledgers, coded emails, photos of faces both familiar and new. It was a gold mine. Every transaction, every drop point, every name that tied the drug ring to Ash Hollow and beyond. Enough to dismantle a criminal operation that had shadowed the town for years. Megan's hands shook with a cocktail of adrenaline and relief. "We've got them," she whispered, scrolling through the damning evidence. This is what Noah was protecting, what they were willing to kill him for. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the front of the building. The door banged open, shouts cut through the air. Megan's heart leapt as she recognized the voices. Other officers, not strangers. But with the news of their breakthrough, the station became a hive of activity. Backup arrived from neighboring counties, phones rang nonstop, and word of an imminent raid spread quickly. Officers pored over the data, linking names and addresses, mapping out a coordinated strike. Earl slumped in his chair, tears in his eyes, as Shadow rested his head in his lap. "He did it," Earl murmured, stroking the old dog's ears. "That boy risked everything to save this town." As police prepared for the raid, Megan called Clara with the news. "We've got what we need. We're moving tonight. Noah will have justice." And Shadow, he saved more than just one life. Clara, voice thick with emotion, relayed the news to Noah, who managed the faintest of smiles before exhaustion pulled him under again. As the sun climbed over Ash Hollow, a battered German shepherd sat on the front steps of the police station, watching the officers load up and prepare to end the nightmare that had haunted their community for too long. For the first time in a long time, hope felt real, a fragile, stubborn thing that grew in the places you least expected. The real work was just beginning. But for now, with the USB drive safe and the law on their side, Earl wrapped his arms around Shadow, holding on tight. "We're not finished yet, old friend. But thanks to you and to Noah, this town's got a fighting chance." That evening, Ash Hollow's silence shattered with the low thrum of engines and the blue glare of police lights bouncing off snowy eaves. For the first time in years, the whole department moved as one. Local deputies, state troopers, even a couple of agents from Denver who'd been after this cartel for months. The files Megan and Earl had delivered were a roadmap, each name and address checked and rechecked. The air buzzed with nervous energy. Nobody wanted mistakes tonight. In the hospital, Noah Carter drifted between sleep and wakefulness, every sound muffled by morphine and exhaustion. His body ached, his thoughts blurred, but he recognized Clara's voice reading updates aloud as officers moved in. Each radio crackle, each distant siren, gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, his suffering had been worth it. Back at the station, Earl sat with Shadow on the worn linoleum floor, hands tangled in the shepherd's fur. They listened together as the raid began. Updates rolling in. Team Bravo moving in, door breached. Suspect fleeing out the back, K9 in pursuit. Evidence secured. One in custody. Megan, armor vest strapped tight, led her team into the largest of the houses listed in Noah's files. Snow squeaked under their boots as they swept through dim, cluttered rooms. The criminals, caught off guard, barely put up a fight. Some tried to run. Most simply froze as the police crashed through their world. It wasn't glorious, just desperate, tense, and full of relief as handcuffs clicked shut. At the same time, Clara organized her own small team at the hospital, nurses, volunteers, and a couple of her rescue dogs, all ready to help however they could. Word spread that the drugs flooding their town were finally being cut off at the source. Families gathered in waiting rooms, some in tears, others clinging to hope. For a moment, the hospital felt less like a place of suffering and more like a community waking up from a long, bitter dream. As news of the arrests hit local television, Noah watched from his hospital bed, Clara by his side. He gripped her hand, unable to keep tears from stinging his eyes. "I thought I'd never see this," he whispered, voice barely audible. "All that time, I kept thinking it wouldn't matter, that I'd just be another name in the files. But they did it, Clara. They really did it." Clara squeezed his fingers gently. "You matter, Noah. You did something no one else could. You held on long enough for the truth to come out." The scene shifted from one arrest to another. Sullen faces, hands behind backs. Police ushering dealers and ringleaders into waiting cars. The town, so long gripped by fear, began to thaw. Windows cracked open. Neighbors peeked out. For the first time in years, hope was louder than fear. Shadow, battered but proud, stood beside Earl as deputies returned to the station, the last rays of sun turning the snow gold. An officer brought in a rescued puppy, spotted, gangly, all giant paws and nervous energy. Shadow sniffed the little dog, then sat and allowed the pup to curl beside him. The image brought a rare smile to Earl's lips. "That's a good sign," Earl murmured, watching as Shadow seemed to take the puppy under his wing. "Looks like he's finally ready for some company." The moment felt symbolic. One generation guiding the next, hope springing up where wounds had been. Megan entered the station, flushed with victory but heavy-eyed with exhaustion. She knelt down, arms wrapping around Shadow and the puppy. "You saved this town, old boy. You and Noah." She ruffled Shadow's ears, her own voice cracking. "I wish every town had someone like you watching over it." In the days that followed, the town of Ash Hollow began to change. News crews arrived, broadcasting the story of the busted drug ring and the dog who'd saved an officer's life. Clara, inspired by what she'd witnessed, launched a new K9 therapy and rescue program, turning the old ranger station into a training ground for dogs like Shadow, wounded, retired, but never without purpose. Noah, his police career ended by his injuries, faced his own crossroads. At first, he felt lost, his sense of self tangled up in the job he could no longer do. But as he spent more time at Clara's program, helping train and comfort other dogs, he found healing he hadn't thought possible. Kids from town came to visit, learning from Noah and the dogs about loyalty, trust, and courage. The community, once fragmented by fear, began to reconnect. Earl, too, found something new. He started visiting the ranger station, bringing supplies and sharing old stories with the next wave of dog handlers. The cabin that had been his fortress of solitude became a gathering place, where laughter replaced loneliness, and the fire always burned warm. Shadow, for his part, recovered from his injuries slowly. Some scars would never fully fade. He still limped on cold mornings, but he carried himself with new pride. He bonded with the rescued puppy, showing patience and tolerance Earl hadn't seen since the early days. The sight of the two dogs, young and old, side by side became a symbol for the whole town. Survival and hope, forged together. One afternoon, as the winter sun melted the last of the snow, Noah, Clara, Earl, and Shadow gathered on the porch of the ranger station. The TV news was still running stories about Ash Hollow's miracle dog, but the real miracle, they agreed, was the town itself, pulled back from the brink by courage, persistence, and the unlikely bond between a wounded cop and an even more wounded dog. Noah ran his hand through Shadow's fur, voice low but steady. "You never gave up on me, did you?" Shadow nudged him, tail thumping. A simple answer. Earl grinned, looking out at the kids playing with the puppy. "You can't keep hope down, not in a place like this." As dusk settled, the group lingered on the porch, a small circle of survivors and friends, their laughter echoing into the calm. For Ash Hollow, it was a new chapter, one built on lessons learned the hardest way, and the quiet promise that, from now on, nobody would ever face the darkness alone. The snow had mostly melted by the time Ash Hollow hosted its spring festival, a celebration meant to shake off the cold and welcome the town back to itself. Strings of lights crisscrossed Main Street, and the scent of grilling barbecue and sweet kettle corn wafted on the breeze. The night buzzed with laughter, music, and the easy comfort of neighbors gathered together. No one had forgotten the darkness of winter, but tonight, they chose to honor the light. Beneath a wide white tent, townspeople drifted from booth to booth, lingering over homemade quilts and jars of honey. Near the bandstand, a small crowd gathered around a makeshift stage. At its center, nervously clutching a microphone, stood Noah Carter. His left arm was still wrapped in a soft brace, and a faint scar ran along his jaw, but his eyes were bright, reflecting the strings of lanterns overhead. Clara and Earl stood close by, Shadow at their feet, regal as ever, with the rescued puppy lying curled against his side. The mayor gave a brief introduction, but all attention turned to Noah as he took a slow breath and began to speak. "I never expected to be standing up here," he started, his voice uneven. "A few months ago, I thought my story might end out there, in the snow. I thought I'd be just another name you whispered about, another tragedy." He paused, searching for words. The crowd held their collective breath. "But I was saved," Noah continued. "Not by luck, not by my own strength, but by a dog who refused to give up. Shadow didn't know my story, my failures, or my regrets. He didn't care about the mistakes I'd made. He just knew I needed help, and he stayed with me when everyone else was gone." Heads nodded throughout the tent, And more than a few people wiped away tears, Noah's words seemed to unearth memories in everyone present. Losses survived, loneliness endured, old wounds that had scabbed over but never fully healed. I've had a lot of time to think since then, Noah went on, his gaze settling on Shadow, whose tail thumped quietly at the sound of his name. And I realized something. Scars don't mean we're broken. They mean we survived. Shadow and I, we both carry our scars. His on the outside, mine on the inside. But in saving each other, we learned that wounds heal best when you let someone in. As Noah spoke, Clara remembered her own darkest nights, the feeling that no one would ever understand her losses, the guilt that followed her out of the Air Force and into every rescue she organized. Earl remembered the quiet ache of the cabin after his wife passed, how he'd almost let the world shrink down to 4 lonely walls. Even the children at the front of the crowd, some still afraid of the dark, leaned in, sensing that this story mattered. Noah continued, "It's easy to believe you have to go it alone, but it's a lie. Healing happens when we let people, sometimes even animals, see us at our worst and stay anyway. That's what Shadow did for me. That's what you all did for each other, coming together when our town needed it most." He stepped back, letting the words settle. The band started up a gentle tune, and the festival resumed. But something had shifted. Conversations turned more thoughtful, old feuds softened. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves laughing side by side over chili or pie. The entire community, it seemed, was taking a deep breath together, letting the lessons of the past season sink in. After the speech, a little boy approached Shadow, drawn by the dog's gentle eyes and quiet strength. His mother nudged him forward, and the boy, cheeks flushed with nerves, sat down beside Shadow, burying his face in the dog's fur. For a long moment, neither moved, but slowly the boy's trembling stopped, replaced by a small, quiet smile. Clara watched, recognizing something of herself in the child, a kind of relief that only comes from being truly understood, no words required. Nearby, Earl told stories to a group of teens, describing how Shadow had tracked lost hikers or found a wounded deer in the snow. The kids listened wide-eyed, some glancing at the dog as if seeing a legend come to life. One girl asked, "Do you think any dog could be as brave as Shadow?" Earl grinned and replied, "Bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about showing up, even when you're scared. That's something every one of us can do." As dusk settled, families wandered out to the festival's edge, where lanterns flickered among the cottonwoods. Clara sat quietly with Noah, both of them watching Shadow nuzzle the rescued puppy and the children who crowded around. "He's more than just a pet," Noah said softly. "He's a bridge between people, between hope and despair, between what we survive and how we go on." Clara nodded, letting herself feel the full weight of that truth. We're all bridges for someone else, if we choose to be. The festival ended with a burst of fireworks, the night sky blooming in color above Ash Hollow. People hugged, children squealed, and for the first time in a long while, the town felt whole. The hardships of winter, the terror of crime and loss, the ache of old wounds, none of it had vanished. But it had been met and matched by empathy, loyalty, and the refusal to let each other go. Later, as the tents came down and lights faded, Shadow lay beneath the stars, head on Noah's lap, the rescued puppy nestled beside him. For Ash Hollow, the lesson was clear. True healing is never solitary. It is a work of connection, slow, imperfect, but always possible. And sometimes the greatest teachers walk on 4 legs, carrying the wisdom of persistence, loyalty, and love. As the festival lanterns dimmed and families drifted home, the quiet of Ash Hollow settled in once more, softer, gentler than before. The snow was mostly gone, but the spring air still held a chill, carrying the promise of new beginnings. On a hillside just beyond the town, 4 figures lingered beneath a spreading oak, gazing out over the sleepy lights of Ash Hollow. Earl sat on the grass, back braced against the ancient tree's trunk, his arm around Clara's shoulders. Noah, still thin and recovering, but stronger each week, rested nearby with his crutch by his side. Shadow sprawled between them all, head in Noah's lap, the rescued puppy snuggled at his belly, twitching in puppy dreams. They didn't speak for a while. Words felt unnecessary, the silence alive with the gentle chorus of crickets and the distant laughter of children chasing fireflies down in the valley. At last, Earl broke the quiet. You know, there were nights I thought I'd never see something like this again. Not after everything we lost. Clara smiled, leaning into him. We never really lose it, Earl. Sometimes hope just gets buried. Takes a little digging to bring it back up. Noah looked down at Shadow, absently scratching behind the shepherd's ear. He never stopped digging, not for me, not for anyone. For a long moment, they just sat together, no longer isolated by pain, but knit together by the ordeal they'd shared. It was the kind of stillness that only comes after surviving something that should have broken you. Clara spoke softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of a lifetime spent rescuing both animals and people. You know, most folks think healing happens all at once, like you wake up one day and everything is better. But really, it's 1,000 little steps, sometimes forward, sometimes back, and sometimes it takes a dog's stubborn heart to remind us what we're capable of. Noah nodded, watching as Shadow gently licked the sleeping puppy's ear. I lost everything I thought mattered. My job, my confidence, even my faith. But I found more than I could have dreamed. Found all of you. His voice was thick with emotion, and Earl patted his shoulder. That's what makes us whole again, son. The folks and animals we let in, after the storms. They watched the sun slip lower behind the mountains, golden light painting the snowmelt and wildflowers on the hillside. Down in town, the festival's closing notes echoed, someone strumming a guitar, laughter rising and falling. The world felt wide open again. Earl, who'd spent so many years walled off in his cabin, felt the difference most keenly. I always thought solitude was my strength, he said. But I see now it was just armor. I was so afraid of losing one more thing, I almost missed out on everything that's left. Clara squeezed his hand. It's not weak to love again, Earl, or to let yourself need someone. The group sat in easy company, sharing stories as dusk slipped into full night. They talked about the people they'd saved and the ones they'd lost, about the risks they'd taken and the scars they carried. There was no pretending that pain wasn't real or that life hadn't left marks. But those wounds, like Noah had said at the festival, meant survival. And survival meant there was still a chance to build something better. Shadow shifted, lifting his head as if listening to the breeze. He looked from one friend to the next, eyes shining with loyalty and contentment. There was a quiet strength in him, a sense that he'd found his purpose, not just in work, but in love, in being the bridge between broken hearts. The rescued puppy stirred, climbing over Shadow's back to snuffle at Noah's hand. Noah laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months, the sound rolling down the hillside. He's going to be a handful, Noah said. Good, I'm ready. For Clara, the moment brought clarity. Her new K-9 therapy and rescue program had begun attracting volunteers from all over the county. Teachers, first responders, even a few teenagers who'd once felt as lost as she had. She saw the future taking shape. Dogs like Shadow and this puppy becoming symbols of second chances, their scars a map for others who needed healing. Earl found himself planning for the first time in years, not just for another winter, but for seasons of friendship, for the young handlers and lost dogs he could help. His cabin would never again be as lonely. The woods, once haunted by grief, now seemed alive with possibility. As the stars bloomed overhead, the four friends fell silent once more, letting gratitude wash over them. They had endured loss, violence, fear, and loneliness, but they'd chosen to reach out instead of shutting down. Each had risked their heart again and found it mended, stronger than before. Shadow finally settled with a sigh, content. Noah whispered, "Thank you, old friend." Earl smiled. Clara brushed a tear from her cheek. The lesson, clear as the spring night, was simple. Resilience isn't about never being hurt. It's about choosing to trust, to heal, and to love again, no matter what you've lost. Animals like Shadow show us how. They meet us at our lowest, wait out our storms, and guide us gently back toward hope. As Ash Hollow slept below, the group sat under the stars, savoring the peace they'd fought so hard to reclaim. The world was far from perfect, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, there was only this: warmth, love, and the deep, unbreakable bond between people and the animals who heal them. So as the sun set over the valley, Shadow rested his head in Noah's lap, and the future stretched wide with promise. A future built, step by step, on kindness, courage, and the enduring hope that comes when we reach for each other in the darkness and refuse to let go.